everyone, greetings and welcome back for our February team training for teams who are in their first year of the PBIS Academy. I'm Christine Downs.
And I'm Eric Mackey.
And we're trainers for NEPBIS. And this presentation was developed with the support of the NEPBIS network. So today's agenda will be to do a quick review of the class-wide expectations and acknowledgement systems we addressed last time. And then we're going to move on to working on a continuum for correcting problem behaviors. And our tasks today will be to develop a list of behavioral definitions for both our major and minor problem behaviors, to construct a discipline flow chart or ladder so staff know how to respond, and to finalize or create an office discipline referral form. So there are some really excellent additional readings and resources in this one that you can access within the syllabus at nepbis.org. First, we have the Responding to Minor Behaviors example sheet from Missouri PBIS. And this is really great in that it provides descriptions of techniques that teachers can use to manage and respond to inappropriate behavior, like using proximity and redirection back to task, things like that. Along those same lines, over on the resource side, you see it says the Continuum of Responses to Inappropriate Behaviors. That's from the Midwest PBIS Center. And that also provides strategies teachers can use. That one does also include some assessment tools. One's a self-assessment and one's an observational assessment tool, so that we can use them to assess, is the teacher using those strategies? The reading, putting a definition back in defiance document from PBIS apps challenges us to define defiance in observable, measurable, and specific terms so that we reduce disproportionality in discipline. It also provides suggestions for responding to defiance in the moment and preventing defiant behavior. So that's a really good one. The Ditch the Clip article, it's a practice brief actually from PBIS.org. And that explains how clip charts are not actually a PBIS practice and they may actually be harmful to students. They provide some alternatives, strategies to promote appropriate class behavior without this sort of public shaming aspect. And then finally, we have the major minor mini module. It's a video module on NEPBIS. You might want to review. Okay. So during the last team meeting, we talked about establishing expectations, especially with regard to routines and supports for students within the classroom where they're spending most of their time, right? And we talked about establishing a system to acknowledge students and staff, right, for their efforts in following the values, the core values, the expectations of the school and the classroom. So we're going to do a quick review here before moving on to correcting problem behaviors. All right. So if you remember, we talked about creating a routine matrix for your classroom, right? Breaking down those common routines instead of locations. We have those common routines up here, along with your core values, right? So things like whole group instruction, cooperative work, right? Transitions, right? And they're going to write down what those look like within the classroom, right? When they get taught and they're established within the classroom, some of these common routines will really help students just to build a habit and know what's expected of them, regardless of whose class they're in, right? But of course, there will be some routines that are unique to each classroom, right? Like the routines in an ELA class are going to be very different than in a science class, especially in a science lab, right? But ideally, even there should be some commonalities, right? Maybe how we enter a classroom and start our do now, or how we request help, right? How we exit class, right? Where can we have some commonalities either across the grade level or possibly across departments, right? And of course, teachers should include any expectations for remote learning or any new safety protocols for in-person learning within the matrix. If you haven't had a chance yet to present this to staff, you might want to consider using some professional development time or grade level meetings to provide your teachers with some time to talk about this and create their own matrices. before the beginning of school. So remember, once we teach them, right, the expectations and routines, we want to acknowledge them for making the effort to follow them. So that's both for students and adults, right? Think about what you've come up with so far, right? There are lots of helpful resources online to get you started, but we always advocate for asking the students and faculty what they want to earn, what would be, reinforcing to them. Lots of schools use surveys or discussions with student leadership committees and staff, right, to gather that information. Do please understand, this is not a one and done type of thing, right? Acknowledgement systems should be ongoing, right? They're continuous, right? They're varied and they're desirable by the people who are receiving them, right? So you might need to resurvey your students and teachers, maybe twice a year, definitely yearly. Make sure that it keeps the system fresh and interesting. And you don't need to start from scratch, right? One or more of your teachers probably has an excellent, strong, and creative system in their classroom that they're using already. Ask them, right? Maybe you can expand that class-wide system to a school-wide system, right? And think about how that will gain more buy-in, right? So keep in mind, with us spending more time teaching online, it's also helpful to have an acknowledgement system that can be used both live and in virtual settings. And thankfully, there are a few systems we reviewed last time that are available to help us do that. Don't forget that the adults need acknowledgements too, right? Staff acknowledgement systems can really be helpful in boosting the morale of staff and encouraging them to try these new PBIS related skills. Just like the students, be sure to ask them how they'd like to be acknowledged. Sometimes we use shout outs, sometimes it's just a nice little thoughtful candy, or even a chance to win a get out of school early card for their efforts. So if your team hasn't done this so far, spend some time developing a grid or a matrix of your current acknowledgement system. Do you have high frequency acknowledgements, things that happen daily, like gotcha tickets when students display expected behaviors? How about monthly celebrations of students or grade level celebrations, right, when they reach a goal? And don't forget to schedule a school-wide celebration, and that really helps build that community and promote a positive culture in your school. So look at what you already have and then ask yourself what's missing, right? When you have a moment, ask some of your peers, either in your school or maybe from other schools, maybe other schools you worked at, what kind of acknowledgement systems they saw used successfully with students and staff. And then write down what you hear and bring it back to your team for a discussion and decide on what you're going to go with, right? And what you could feasibly do.
So despite our best efforts to be proactive, the reality is that students will still make behavioral errors and test our limits. So we want to be prepared with a continuum of responses. We're going to talk about 3 important components to developing a hierarchy of responses to behavior. That includes clear definitions for undesirable behaviors, discipline flowcharts, and discipline referral forms, sometimes called ODRs. These components ensure a consistent system of responses. First, we're going to focus on clearly defining the unexpected or undesirable behaviors. We want to provide full, objective, measurable definitions so that everyone in the building could identify the behavior accurately if they saw it. Once the behaviors are defined, we want to classify the behaviors as being either minor behavior or major behaviors. Minor behaviors are those behaviors that are typically managed within the classroom setting. They tend to be lower intensity, less disruptive, and possibly more frequent. Major behaviors are those behaviors that are typically managed outside of the classroom. They tend to be high intensity and possibly less frequent behaviors. Such classification helps to delineate whose responsibility it is to respond to a behavior. But remember, it's not enough to know that you are responsible for responding to a behavior. You also need to have tools to do so. It may be helpful to start with a T-chart like this. breaking down how major and minor behaviors are defined and providing examples. This is another example, or rather another activity, where it's important to have key stakeholder involvement. So include your teachers, your parents, and especially your administrators on the development of these definitions, classifications, and the responses. You may think that these things are obvious to you and your peers at your school, but imagine a substitute coming into your school or a new teacher to your school. Would that person know what is managed within the classroom or within your school or what goes to the office? How would that person know? This process takes what may be presumed knowledge and documents it to reduce any confusion and frustration. The label disruption is a popular one in schools, yet it can really cover a lot of ground. So you could have a student who's tapping a pencil and you could have a student who's flipping a desk, and they can both be considered disruptive. But should they create the same responses from the adults? Hopefully you're saying no. They're different in their intensity, and the responses should be tailored to their level of intensity. So it's helpful to break down broad terms like disruption, disrespect, and have a conversation about what those terms actually look like. Then break those descriptions down into major versus minor behaviors. Such efforts can help to reduce the chance of us providing overly restrictive consequences to students due to a very broad behavioral category. A nice culturally responsive adaptation to the T-chart is a pie chart that can be found in the Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide, page 38. It breaks behaviors down into situationally inappropriate, staff managed, and office managed. Situationally inappropriate behaviors are those that may or may not be appropriate for school contexts. Some examples might be touching peers to get their attention or moving around during class. Christine, do you have any examples?
Yeah, I'm thinking of one that's where some teachers have the rule, ask three before you ask me. So ask three peers for those low level, like what page are we on? What book are we using? And if a teacher is doing a lesson and a student leans over, if I lean over to you and say, what page are we on? That's appropriate in that moment because that actually is the rule. I'm not trying to be disruptive. So teachers need to kind of take a look at that. Oh, they're actually doing what I want them to do. They're not disrupting the lesson. They're quickly asking. We might say, hey, can you ask that in a quieter voice? But situationally, it is appropriate.
That's a great example. So in teaching students the expectations for school, we'll need to explicitly teach the appropriate skill to help students to code switch. Once you've identified the behaviors that you most frequently address, you'll need to create definitions for those behaviors so it's crystal clear what the behaviors look like and to reduce any gray areas, which can lead to that heavy discipline. If you're looking for some nice examples, and if you happen to be thinking about employing Swiss, check out these referral definitions by PBIS apps. Here's a nice example, clearly breaking down what a behavior may look like depending on the severity level. You see that this team has categorized behaviors as being a warning reteach behavior, a minor offense, or a major offense. Each of these terms have been defined, which is incredibly helpful to teams when they are trying to sort out which behaviors belong to which category. This also helps the reader to understand how each behavior was categorized. From there, each behavior is described and how it looks at each severity level, making it clear that offensive remarks are going to be handled differently than swearing used to harass or intimidate. I appreciate how this document also includes the desirable expected behavior. This can guide staff towards reminding and reteaching the expected behaviors. The next component I'm going to talk about is a discipline flowchart. You may already have a form of a discipline flowchart in place. This is generally a document with a visual of the process for responding to behavior and how we track those behavioral incidences. It's supposed to be a quick reference guide for staff and for students. It includes how behaviors are managed in the classroom and by administration. Ideally, this also provides guidance as to what information is tracked and when. I'll provide an example in just a moment. We've developed a rough list or a checklist of things you'll likely want to consider when developing your referral process. Note, this isn't exhaustive, but here are a few things to consider, like what is our process? How do I refer someone for an incident? How does this referral get to the office? And what is the process for making minor referrals versus the major referrals? Here's a sample flowchart. In the top left corner, it says start here. The content there highlights the fact that the teacher should be using proactive strategies to prevent undesirable behavior. Then you move to the top center triangle, inappropriate behavior. If it's a minor, you follow the process directly below it. If it's a major, you follow the process to the right. If a minor behavior, there are suggested strategies the teacher may use to try to address a behavior and thresholds for documenting minor behaviors. If it's a major behavior, then the section to the right outlines the process for sending the students to the office, completing the major referral, and the administrator's response options. This is all on one page. Here's an example from a high school. It contains similar information, but in the middle, it includes a listing of which behaviors are teacher managed versus administration managed. There's even a prompt for gray area issues, because those are just going to happen, in that they suggest that the teacher contact a counselor, admin, or support staff in those scenarios that aren't already listed. All flowcharts should have a teaching response to problem behaviors, ideally referring to reinforcing and reteaching the expected behavior should be the first component when dealing with minor or class managed behaviors. Administrative assigned behaviors should also have a follow-up component to ensure that the student has socially acceptable strategies for when the situation arises again in the future. This flowchart includes a script for conversations for success. This provides teachers with a guide for problem solving with students around undesirable behaviors, such as script goes, I noticed you doing X behavior. Tell me what you should be doing instead. Can you do that? Do you need help in doing that? Please show me what that behavior would look like. And then the teacher provides some positive praise and feedback around that practice. And then can you follow up on following that expectation? A really nice short script that teachers can use, and it's right there in front of them. This school uses a level system instead of a flowchart, and that can be used alongside of a flowchart. You can see that the behaviors are organized by the severity of the behavior, and the consequences along the bottom become progressively more undesirable and more restrictive. You could consider level 1 and level 2 behaviors to be minor behaviors, and level 3 and level 4 behaviors to be major behaviors. This provides teachers with a nice source of tools to pull from in responding to student behavior. Here again, it's important to have administrative consensus on the progressive discipline, especially as they will be responsible for managing the major behaviors. We want to be on the same page. A continuum of consequences with progressive discipline is essential in creating a consistent discipline system. So let's back up a bit. Why develop a continuum? Well, firstly, we want to step away from having the same consequences apply to all rule violations. So instead of sending students to the office as being the sole consequence for undesirable behaviors, we want to build an array of strategies that can be used by teachers and by administrators. We also create a continuum to create a hierarchy of responses that align with the severity of the behavior. For example, the first time a student is tardy to class, we wouldn't suspend them for 3 days, right? So maybe a student who's tardy to class might have to serve a lunch detention the first time around. If that student continues to be tardy, the consequences may progressively increase in intensity. This is referred to as progressive discipline, and it allows for differentiation amongst students. Another example, if there are 2 students who get a referral for fighting, maybe for student 1, it's their first offense, and they might get called, they might get a detention, and their parents might get called. For the second student, maybe it's their fifth offense, and they might have an in-person meeting with the principal and parents, and possibly an in-school or out-of-school suspension. So in creating a hierarchy of consequences, the least severe consequences should match the behaviors or rule violations that are deemed least severe. The most severe consequences should be reserved for the most severe rule violations. It's also important to have a progressive array of consequences that might begin with a warning and progress in intensity. We also want to create a continuum to address the needs and the reasons why behind a student's behavior. For example, if a student is swearing in the hopes of being sent out of class to escape the classwork, if we send the student out, we'd be reinforcing that behavior of escaping from the work. So instead, we should redirect the behavior to a more appropriate means of expressing frustration while figuring out the why the student is trying to escape the work. Or in the least, the work should follow the student wherever she goes. Some things to keep in mind when building your continuum of consequences. First of all, keep those functions or whys in mind when building those responses. You want to have options for students who are trying to escape the people, things, and activities, and also for those students who are trying to get access to those things, those activities, and people. For instance, if a student disrupts class to get adult attention, should not be rewarded with one-on-one time with an adult. You also want to align your responses to your matrix, the one that you've developed recently. Some schools find it helpful to use their matrix to organize what non-examples of desired behaviors may look like and how teachers may respond. Keep in mind that this continuum is not the crux of PBIS, but a piece of a larger system. The emphasis should always be on teaching the expected behaviors, acknowledging students for performing it, or at least trying to exhibit those desired behaviors. And once you've designed your hierarchy, the team will need to teach, reinforce, and monitor staff's use of the hierarchy to make sure that it's being used effectively and appropriately. Remember, this takes time and practice. As I just said, our emphasis should always be on the proactive, teaching and reinforcing. If we don't teach and reinforce new strategies for the students to use, and instead lean on punitive strategies, we increase the risk of aggression, vandalism, truancy, and dropout. We want to treat misbehavior as errors in behavior, like an error in math, writing, or playing notes. It's an opportunity for feedback, teaching, and practicing a new skill. We're educators. When we see a pattern across a grade level, a location, or a time of day, we should consider moving beyond an individual student teaching and respond at the class, grade, or whole school level. If you're looking for examples, you can grab the ones from this slide deck, and you can check out our exemplar repository on nepbis.org. So ultimately, what we're looking for your teams to do is to develop labels of the behaviors you see in schools and clear definitions for those behaviors and responses to those behaviors. Keep in mind that you ultimately want a finite list of behaviors without duplicates. So you might have one category for abusive language, inappropriate language, profanity, one category, or defiance, insubordination, noncompliance, another category. If you already have such a list, you may wish to consider updating your list with behaviors that we now see during online classes. And once the behaviors have been labeled and defined, you want to identify the procedures for responding to those behaviors. When you're next with your team, spend some time identifying your problem behaviors, defining them, and developing your flowchart. In your flowchart, be sure to include how you will track behaviors. If you don't yet have a tracking system, we'll actually be talking more about such systems next month. If your team isn't yet at a place where you're able to discuss your responses to behavior, maybe you're still establishing your values, your lessons, your acknowledgement systems, go ahead and put this on your action plan to be addressed when your team is ready.
Okay, so for the last component we're going to talk about today, it's the office discipline referral form, often called the ODR. Right? It helps give us consistency in monitoring and recording information about problem behaviors, and it's essential to being able to efficiently and effectively address the patterns of behavior. So your office discipline referral form, again, ODR for short, it's a paper or digital document that schools should use to track problematic behavior, right? Tracking allows us to identify those patterns of behaviors ranging from whole school-wide behavioral issues to maybe groups of individuals to individual student behavior issues. In order to be able to problem solve with this data, we need to make sure that the form gathers the information we need so that there's a clear process for completing the form. Right? And that was part of that flow chart, as well as the documentation itself. We want to create a documentation system that's quick, clear, and easy for the adults to use. Right? Training for the staff, resource documents like that flow chart we just saw, and feedback about how well they're doing help make sure that the information we're gathering is accurate and usable. Some things you might want to consider when looking at your ODR process is, one, how will the form be completed? Should it be completed via paper, or are we using a paperless system, or are we using a combination of both? Right? Will you be documenting both major behaviors and minor behaviors, or are you going to just do majors? If you're documenting both, will you be using the same form? Or are you going to have two different forms? Will they be entered into the same database like Aspen or Swiss or PowerSchool, or are you using two different ones? Some critical questions you want to include on your form that will aid in the problem solving are those WH questions, the who, what, where, when, and whys of the behavior. Look at that right now. So here you go. With regards to identifying those who, what, where, when, and whys of student behavior, you really need to make sure that your referral form gathers that information, right? Your ODR form should include, and you can look over here, so student name, obviously, the date, the time of the incident, not the time you're completing the form, right? So we can tell, is there a time of day that's most difficult? Obviously, the student's grade, the referring staff, the person who saw the problem behavior. We don't fill in the primary teacher or the homeroom teacher unless it's a different category. We want the referring staff who is involved in that behavior. Of course, the location of the incident, the actual problem behavior. Perceived motivation. This is really important in that it helps us identify the why of the behavior. This is also kind of the function of behavior. So what did the student want when they acted out? This helps us plan for an appropriate response that meets the same need for the student, but being appropriate for the school setting, right? So there is a document called Guidelines for Motivation, and it's available at pbisapps.org. And that can be distributed and reviewed with staff so they understand what adult attention-seeking behavior looks like versus what task avoidance behavior looks like. Sometimes they get those things mixed up. So with this information, and of course others involved, action taken, and any notes on the referral form or some other categories you want on there. And then with all of this information, your tier 1, your tier 2, and even your tier 3 teams will have sufficient information to create clear problem statements. And these clear precision problem statements help your team to problem solve efficiently and create really effective behavior support plans. So before we go any further, we want to clarify what your ODR form is and what it is not. Right? It is documentation of interactions between students, staff, and administrators. Right? It's documentation of clear, discrete, well-defined behaviors. And a document that can only, capture so much information, right? Especially if you've designed it to be completed efficiently. It's a document that helps a team to make decisions regarding how to support individual students and groups of students, as well as teachers and staff. We want to support them as well too. What it is not, it's not your first step in addressing behavior. Teachers need to be proactive in using those proactive strategies like proximity, right? Like redirection, like using that hairy eyeball, looking at the kid before we think about just jumping to filling out an office discipline referral form, right? Along those same lines, an ODR is not punishment or correction in and of itself, right? There should be a separate response to the behavior by the teacher or the administrator that conforms to your continuum of progressive discipline. And then speaking of that, an ODR is not a way to change or reteach the behavior, right? Again, that's a separate adult behavior. This is documentation. Okay, however, there are some forms that you may include in your ODR, like a think sheet or a processing sheet, and that might engage students in a dialogue about their behavior. And that could be an opportunity for reteaching a new behavior to use instead. But that's a little bit different from the documentation process we're talking about here, where the details of the event are gathered for the purposes of creating a response and new teaching and documenting what's going on and looking for problem behavior, patterns of behavior. Lastly, an ODR is not a reflection on any teacher's skill, right? If anything, it's a paper trail that can lead to strategies to support teachers and staff. So here's an example of an office discipline reform. It gathers both major and minor problem behaviors. It prompts for all that information I just reviewed, right? The name, grade, date, teacher, time, all that, possible motivation, all those important information. And it includes on this one, even a section on strategies that the teacher took prior to the referral. So sometimes that can be helpful for the administrator to know what the teacher did before the referral got sent down. You'll notice that there's very little writing on here. There's some small sections because we only need critical information, right? Like student knocked over her desk and ripped up her paper when she was asked to complete some classwork, right? Clear, concise, to the point. Other than that, it's mostly check boxes to keep the form really simple and easy for adults. Here is another ODR form that gathers information regarding both major and minor again. And this one's developed to be sort of a running log for an individual student. So this might be good for use in maybe a sub-separate program, or you're tracking one student's behavior. It's got a lot of behaviors. And here we have an example of a minor referral form, a paper version. And this might be useful mostly in an elementary school, but it could be used in middle and high as well. Notice that the form for each incident is short. It's just a quarter of a page. There's 4 to a page. And there's sort of spaces in front of it to put check marks in for, again, for easiness of filling it out. And it does gather all the relevant information, name, staff, grade, date, right, the behavior and the consequences. Some schools, one that I work with specifically, did use this as their way to track repeated minor behaviors. So it would be the same student on the form, really with a similar minor behavior. And once they got to the 5th, they fill out 4. And then once they got to the 5th minor behavior of the same type of behavior, they would write a major referral and then staple this or hand this in with the major. And then everything gets entered into the system. And they do that so they can still see the pattern of behaviors, what was happening, when, where, what time, so they can see if they can address that pattern. If you do decide to track minor behaviors, we definitely suggest that your team and school think really critically about which behaviors you're going to track and how they get tracked. Because it could certainly get really overwhelming for a teacher if they think they have to document every time a student taps their pencil or is a little bit disruptive. Right? You definitely want to make sure teachers understand the difference between correcting behavior, right, which we do all day long, right? Turn around, sit down, eyes up here, and then a minor behavior. And a minor behavior usually has some kind of teacher consequence. It could be, just a discussion with a teacher. It could be moving a seat, right? Calling a parent. We consider a minor behavior. And then a major behavior. And those are behaviors that are going to have administrative involvement. So you want to make sure they understand those 3 levels of behavior correction. This one is a really creative example of how one school combined their yellow discipline office referral forms with their blue positive referral forms. On top, there are, I think, 10 discipline sheets of the yellow sheet, and there's 100 blue positive referrals to hand out to students. And staff can't get more yellow discipline sheets unless they've distributed all of their blue positive referrals. So this way, it ensures that the staff are using those proactive strategies and hopefully attaining at least a 10-to-1 positive negative ratio, which is much more than the 4-to-1 that we say is at least a minimum. So a teacher could be giving out actually, 200 blue positive referrals, and maybe they only use 3 or 4 yellows, but they can't get more of the negative unless they do all the positive, which I think is a really interesting adaptation. Okay, so as you develop, revamp, or review your continuum of procedures to decrease problem behaviors, make sure that you develop an office discipline referral that gathers all of that information I just went over that you'll need to problem solve those WH questions. Okay? Develop a clear process for addressing behaviors that are taught and reviewed with all staff. So keep in mind, if staff aren't at your faculty meeting, how are you going to train staff that don't attend those meetings? Remember that sharing data with staff is one of the most powerful strategies you can use to get staff to implement your proactive and response strategies, right? So find ways to summarize your office discipline problem data and show it to your peers. Show them the trends in student behavior. Maybe you had a lot of problem behaviors in the hallway, so you proactively address the hallway. And now this month you want to show them how that proactive addressing of the hallways maybe has reduced the problem behaviors there. Let them see that pattern change. You want to track the frequency of your acknowledgements also, right? Like we kind of talked about before, and compare it with the frequency of the referrals and other discipline actions, right? So you can get a sense, are we getting to that 4-to-1 positive to negative ratio, or maybe above that? And of course, use the data as a way to identify students or groups of students who are in need of more support and to track their responses to the interventions you put in place. Okay, now with your team, review your current discipline referral system, right? If you don't have a form yet, look at our examples or for the exemplar examples on any PBIS, or look at the examples forms from PBIS apps. You can use the tips and guidelines we provided here and make adjustments needed for your current form so they can fit all the guidelines we gave you. Definitely gather feedback from your peers about how easy it is to use the form and try to make it as simple as possible. Lots of check marks, just a little bit of space for writing. And of course, still gather those WH questions. Once the form is ready, think about how you're going to train your staff and so that they know how to use the form, again, electronic or on paper. And if you're not quite at the point yet where you're ready to work on your office referral form, like we've said before, add it to your action plan so you know it's a step you need to get to. Just a quick note, if you're using Swiss, School-Wide Information Systems, as your ODR referral system, that has a referral built into it electronically, and the data fields are fully established, they're finite. So Swiss has done that work of combining the like categories together and narrowing those choices. Swiss does give you the option of adding some custom fields, however. And they have various paper versions that capture all of the fields. And whether you're using Swiss or not, those paper versions are really good examples of office discipline referrals that you can use with any system. Okay. So for today, your tasks should be or should have been to plan how you will have teachers work together on that class-wide expectation matrix. Okay? You're going to evaluate the types of acknowledgements that you're providing at your school and create a matrix for high frequency, intermittent, and long-term celebrations, and then fill in the gaps with ideas from your colleagues or Pinterest or brainstorm new ideas. Review or create a list of problem behaviors, right? And you're going to divide them into minor categories and major categories. Define those behaviors for each behavior and consider using or including an example of what that looks like to make it easier for teachers. Then you're going to construct a discipline flow chart or levels of behavior chart with clear procedures for responding to the behavior and resolving major and minor behaviors. Remember to review your consequences to ensure they're hierarchical and progressive. And you definitely will need full administrative support and involvement for that piece of it. And then finally, review or create your office referral form and take a look at your current discipline system, system for capturing those office referral forms and its capabilities. So thanks for spending time with us today and learning about building a continuum of responses for correcting undesirable behaviors. Next month, we'll talk about database decision-making and how what strategies we can use to integrate and align PBIS with our other initiatives in our building. Okay, so take care and thank you.
Thank you very much.